Roland, I'd like to talk about a very difficult question. That is the question of AIDS. That is so much in the news these days, so much discussion. It's created great personal problems and suffering for many people. It's become a major public policy question. We're trying to, as a culture, to figure out how to deal with it. It's not just a national problem, but an international one. We have large numbers of people infected with the disease in Africa. We have very dire predictions about what's going to happen to the population in Africa. To bring it closer to home, we have millions of people affected with the disease, people who have it and don't know it yet. Projections that by 1991 there will be 180,000 deaths due to AIDS. So we have a massive social problem, and people are well aware that it's hard to live in our culture today without realizing we have a great problem. I suppose I see two kinds of difficulties along this line. One is that some people get in a panic and are fearful and think that you catch it in just casual ways. On the other hand, there's always a danger with massive problems of putting our burying our head and failing to face the magnitude of the problem.
It's a double epidemic, the virus itself and the physical terrible things that it wreaks, but also the epidemic of fear. You know, whenever you're dealing with death or sickness as widespread as this, inevitably some people panic and they start becoming irrational. And I think the church and other rational people in society need to fight the fear, maybe even more than the virus, although our energy has to go in both directions.
I think one of the things we've learned over the years that when we have major social problems, that all of the agents in society, the various groupings and communities, need to work together on this. You mentioned the church. I think surely the university has a role to play in this. The government has a role. Yeah. Families, of course, parents educating their children and so on. The business, the corporate world needs to be a contributor to all of this. Labor unions, everybody who cares about society and our future has to begin to think about the problem. We have to educate ourselves and find really constructive solutions to a most difficult question.
Every single person in society has some role or another, either to educate or simply in living to make sure that they're not exposed to the virus. So, yeah, we all have some part to play.
We could probably talk about this whole question in two different ways. One is the whole question of prevention. The question of prevention brings up the notion of safer sex, as it's called these days, the use of condoms, educating people technically and technique on how to use them, trying to get people to use them more responsibly and so on. It has to do with promoting abstinence and giving good sexual attitudes and outlooks to the next generation and trying to improve all of our own outlooks on sexuality. It has to do with trying to help rid ourselves of the terrible blight of the drug culture. So there are so many facets to it, but all under the heading of prevention. How are we going to stop it because we don't have a cure? And that becomes one side of the problem. But the other side is that we've got these millions of people who are currently infected with the disease, and many people who are going to become ill as time goes on. And it really is quite a terrible, debilitating disease. As a biologist was telling me the other day, that most people die of AIDS really die of other complications. They die of the diseases that attack the body when the immune system is really shut down, which is what AIDS ends up doing, shutting down the immune system, and then people die from other kinds of diseases. So, and it's often very horrible kinds of deaths and involving a lot of suffering.
Yeah, pneumonia or different forms of cancer, what the body, under ordinary circumstances, could deal with. Suddenly with this terrible virus, they're not able to deal with that. And I have been at the bedside of people dying of AIDS and have seen how terrible it is, and you never forget that. Death is always difficult to deal with, but particularly these are often young persons. They're people with a whole lifetime ahead of them, the talent, the opportunities there that die with them, it's overwhelmingly sad. And their families, friends, lovers, the people who are left, also the tragedy in their lives is profound.
Roland, do you want to say a little bit more about the psychology of all of this, of what people who have AIDS and the ones that you've talked to and so on are going through. I imagine there must be immense emotional pressures within one that one has to deal with.
Oh, very much. It would be all of the issues that you deal with any person who is dying, who has a terminal disease, imminent death. But I think added to the AIDS question is the fact that about, I think it's 63% of those with AIDS in our country are gay men. So you have all those issues of being gay also. Very often, for example, when the young man reveals to his family that he's dying, that is also the time that he reveals that he's gay. And you have that double trauma to deal with. And I read statistics somewhere about that. I think it's more than half, actually, of people who finally tell their families they have AIDS. It is also the news that they're gay. And the family has to deal with that. There is anger also. The gay community often perceives the churches, particularly Christian churches, as the enemy. People who have condemned them in the past, even well-meaning church leaders who have, let's say within the Catholic Church, which I know best, presenting the magisterial position on homosexual acts. But what is perceived is a put-down, condemnation. And the result is an anger and a bitterness. It gives a very unique flavor to what you're dealing with in the death of a person with AIDS. Extraordinarily complex.
I don't know if this is really a fair comment or not, but is there any sort of parallel here with people, for example, who have lung cancer and who have smoked regularly for a long period of time and who sort of have to deal within themselves with the question like, well, if I had quit smoking earlier or something, I wouldn't be having this problem right now. Is there a parallel, or is that unfair?
Well, I'm sure that to some extent there is a parallel. It's much more complicated, though, in the gay issues, because most of the people that I have dealt with have come to terms with being gay. And most of them have been Catholic, so I better limit my comments to that, which I know best. And they really have worked out a position different than the magisterial position, which is of accepting themselves and accepting not promiscuity, but a committed lifestyle to one other person. And so they dissent very often from the church teaching and do not see themselves as evil, would condemn promiscuity, for example, but accept themselves as persons living with another man in a gay lifestyle. And then they read pronouncements such as Cardinal Ratzinger's of October 86, in which they are condemned very vigorously. There is an anger that results along with the terrible problem that comes with dying. And as I say, I think it's really unique in trying to deal with a person dying with AIDS, particularly a gay person. I have not really dealt with IV drug users, so I'm sure that's a whole different question. And certainly little babies who get it from their mothers, that's a whole different theological question.
Right, or hemophiliacs.
Hemophiliacs, yeah.
I mean, that is so sad, and often young people, again, and it's so difficult to deal with. I think it raises, Roland, one of the things you mentioned, the church and the church's role in this, anger against the church. The Catholic bishops of the United States have issued a document on this question. They call it The Many Faces of AIDS, a Gospel Response. The administrative board of the Catholic bishops did that. The large gathering of bishops has this committee of about 60 members that often speak in the name of the rest of the bishops, and they have issued this document. And I think one of the points made in the document has to do with compassion. Yes. They tell us that it is really crucial that people try to exercise a proper care and understanding of those who actually have this disease. And that, I think, is a major contribution of this document. I myself think that it is a very well done document. I mean, I know that you have certain criticisms of it, but my own sense that overall it's one of the better things that the bishops have done, and they do a number of good letters like that, I must say, and I think they deserve credit because they often are put down, and very often people are unhappy with the bishops, but they perform a great public service in doing this. In writing a document like that, what happens is it produces discussion. People gather around it, either for it or against it. And one of the great important things about AIDS is that we begin to talk openly about it, that we're able to bring it into the light so that we can look for these reasonable kinds of solutions and deal compassionately with the people who have it.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to put down this statement. I think it's a beautiful statement. It is a compassionate one. It does have shortcomings, and we may go into some of those. But, for example, one of the final statements that they make in it, they say, our response to people with AIDS will be judged truly effective only when we discover God in them, and when they say, through their encounter with us, in my pain, fear, and alienation, I have felt in your presence a God of strength, hope, and solidarity. I could never argue with that. That is magnificent.
It is. It's a great statement and summarizes, I think, a lot of what they have to say about care. I don't know if I ever clarified that, but there's really two kinds of issues with the AIDS: prevention, and the other one is the care, the compassionate care that we should have for those people who have it. Now, that raises all kinds of questions. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which the bishops call upon us to exercise this care. We have to think of, for example, not only the patient, but also the person's family. I was just thinking, using your own description there, that it is at times when the person would reveal they have AIDS, it's the first time they would reveal to their families that they are also homosexual. Yeah. And that so the family would probably need a lot of help in dealing with that. They would be hit with two things that are often difficult to deal with.
Yeah. It's like a double whammy, and I've been in families where that has happened, and I have to be clear also that often it brings out the very best in people. I have seen extraordinary examples of love and compassion that follow that, but on the other hand, some people get abandoned. They're left to die alone. That's happened more than once, and when you see that kind of treatment going on, it's doubly tragic.
It is indeed. So we have to think of ministering to the families and then also being present to those who are dying. And there's a lot of other public policy questions that are involved here and ethical kind of questions. There's the whole idea of trying to have the medical care community continue to minister to these people. I mean, there's a great fear of contracting AIDS. I know the bishops come out very clearly and say that these people have a right to the medical aid that they need, and that therefore the people in the profession have an obligation to offer that care to these patients.
I read a poll recently which is very disturbing of medical students, not yet doctors, but very close to it. The poll indicated that over half of them would choose not to minister to people with AIDS if they could possibly avoid it. And it seems to me the opposite of what medicine is about. It's to heal people, and especially those who are most sick. And you can understand the fears. I don't want to be facile about it. The fear of catching it yourself is real, and I can understand that, but to shirk your responsibilities out of that fear is reprehensible.
I heard a nurse talking about this and saying how that now they speak a lot about the medical profession, the nurses and the doctors, being careful themselves and wearing gloves, for example, in situations where they didn't used to do that. And so there evidently needs to be a whole education along that line for them as well. I'm sure that proper care can help reduce this. I remember hearing physicians have responded in various ways that I've heard on the media. I mean, some have taken the line of saying, no, our responsibility is to care for the sick, and we have to do that, and it's really not an open question. Sure. I remember hearing another one who said that she was doing operations on AIDS patients, and it was saying that this is, I don't know, even she said on television that it was just a question in her of time till an accident would happen, and where the opportunity for this transmission would occur. So, I mean, that is frightening, and doctors obviously, the professionals in the field have to know about all of those things. But I say that just to highlight, I suppose, the problem.
Well, the last time I went to my dentist, I noticed that he's wearing rubber gloves now, and certainly in the area of prevention, they have every right to protect themselves, and there's certainly anything like that they do. But if it gets to the point of not treating people who are dying, there is something wrong with a health system like that.
That raises the ethical questions again, doesn't it, Roland? That you really, the question of responsibility and what one's task really is, and so on. Let's raise another area, and that has to do with employment. One of the things that's happening, of course, is that people with AIDS are sometimes fired from their jobs and not allowed to continue to work even when they could.
Yes.
And so one of the things the bishops say is that persons with AIDS should be able to continue to be employed as long as is appropriate. Now that's a properly ambiguous language. How long is appropriate, everyone would have to figure out. But I think they're telling us just to summarily fire someone because they have AIDS, it would not be proper.
And deprive them probably of health insurance and a lot of other benefits precisely at the time they most need it. It seems to me that any dying person, and maybe especially somebody dying with AIDS, that the challenge that they have to deal with and the real issue is to live for as long as they can until the moment of death comes. And when you have different people in society who cut out their livelihood, cut out their ability to go out and do something meaningful each day, that is at times almost as bad as the disease itself, to take meaning out of life.
Indeed. And I mean, it is so hard to deal with illness to begin with. When you take away the thing that keeps your mind off of it, that gives you a sense of contributing and so on, it really does undercut human dignity. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to get back to that. The ethical dimension again says that what's at bottom in all of this is the dignity and worth of every human being, including people with AIDS. I think that's the way we have to sort of sell the kind of care that we're talking about. It's not, there is a gospel mandate that Jesus was compassionate, and Jesus reached out to those outcasts in his society, and Jesus touched the lepers and was the person who brought them back into the community. I think that's always very important to remember in the miracles of Jesus, that the healing of the disease of leprosy, for example, was accompanied by a methodology of bringing them back into the community. They were cut off and would be, I suppose, the modern equivalent would be AIDS to the leprosy situation at that time. And Jesus reached out, touched them in public, and touched them despite the fear that he was going to get the disease, and then brought them back into the community. Now, so there is a gospel way of looking at this. There's a way out of the whole Judeo-Christian tradition that points out that we are all made in the image of God, the likeness of God, and that people are worthy of respect. But there's also another way that we often argue from what we'd call the natural law, or sort of a common wisdom, a public philosophy that also says, and we're big on this in our culture, that every human being has dignity and worth. And therefore that's what would ground the rights that AIDS victims have, I would say.
Yes. It's rather ironic that the Catholic gay organization is called Dignity. That's a sign of contradiction recently, with so many bishops and an adversarial relationship with Dignity chapters, including here in Toledo. And that produces the anger I was talking about, often with gay persons who perceive that the church is not with them, or church leaders at least, or even Christians who go around talking about God's wrath. And I think relating to what you said about Jesus reaching out and touching people, in the bishop's document, The Many Faces of AIDS, one of the beautiful sections of that talks about divine love being incarnated in people who take care of PWAs, people with AIDS, that we reveal God's love by the human love that we show. And one of the points I'd really like to make, and I guess this would be a criticism of the statement, is that they never acknowledge the fact that that love is being expressed very powerfully within the gay community, because that is the hardest hit segment of our society at the present time. And I see even here in Toledo, for example, a number of organizations which are really gay-founded, treating the question AIDS, get people to help buddy system, and groups that will deal with issues like that. I see that divine love really being incarnated in the gay community, and I just wish the statement would have at least have acknowledged that. I think it would have been more real, and I'm sort of big on reality, you may have noticed. I think if you talk about things really, you're more persuasive. And that thought occurred to me as I went through the statement.
So your point is that there isn't enough recognition of the love that is already being shown within the gay community.
By gays, I think
towards one another who are
exactly,
affected with this. The reason that comes up, of course, is because the statistics suggest that of the people who have AIDS and have shown the symptoms, that 73% are homosexual or bisexual males, and 17% are intravenous drug users, only 1% heterosexuals, people who have generally had sexual contact with those in the high-risk categories. Sure. So that's the reason the whole discussion of homosexuality comes up in this regard, and I think has really clouded the issue, I suppose, in terms of the public policy questions, and has really intensified a lot of the difficulties.
It has. People that I've talked to dying of AIDS have very rarely expressed anger against God. The bishops mentioned that in their statement. It does occur at times, and I always encourage it. I mean, I think God can take it, and if a person is angry against God, they should express that and, again, be honest. But much more often than God, I find church leaders to be the focus of anger. And for honesty's sake, we do need to acknowledge that and to see what can be done about it. If even the bishops themselves recognize it, I think that would be progress.
Roland, take just a little different tact on this thing. Is the responsibility of society really to search for cures in all of this? I think there's a feeling that among some in the society that the government, for example, has not done all that they can do along this line. I was talking to a biologist recently about this and suggesting that we really have done amazingly well with it. He was debunking that idea and saying that there's been few viruses that we ever tracked so quickly. I think we only go back to the beginning of the 80s when they began to work on this, and that they have tracked the virus and have learned more about it in a briefer period of time than any other one. I don't know the exact way he said it, but the impression was clear to me that he felt that the people in the research world, I suppose he was talking about the biological world that he knew best, had really done an excellent job. And of course the problems are massive. He says it's hard to imagine the difficulty of figuring out how to deal with this virus because it is so adaptable and so varied and all of that.
Well, the medical community deserves a lot of credit, I have no doubt, but I don't think too much credit is deserved by our national political leaders. The first case was reported in June of 1981. It was shortly after Reagan came into office. It was a very conservative administration, and they simply did not deal with it. Reagan never mentioned the word AIDS until Rock Hudson died, and I think that was about 86. If you're going to talk about education and really getting people to deal with the epidemic, Ronald Reagan has not had a very good record, nor his administration. And I think that more money could have been spent, should have been spent. I certainly fault them. The medical community did a great job, I guess, given what they had. But there's a great deal more that needs to be done, and we're nowhere near a cure.
The distinction that might be made in your comment is distinguishing the research from the whole question of public education.
Sure.
I guess we like to think of our public leaders as having a responsibility to educate the populace, to help form public opinion, and to do so in a reasonable fashion. And I think that's what you're faulting the administration for, at least in part.
And for quite possibly, I can't prove this, but the strong suspicion is there of homophobia, of the fact that most people dying of AIDS through the 80s were pariahs in society, gay men or IV drug users. If they had been the white heterosexual middle class, I suspect that more money would have been spent, greater efforts made. It's my strong suspicion, as I can't prove it, but it's there.
So, Roland, we're talking a lot about the kind of care that is needed. I was thinking of when you get even beyond the care while the person is alive, the bishops raised the question of the funeral directors as well, that AIDS victims have a right to a proper burial, and that I think there's I don't know what's happening in that area, but there must be some problem that they're addressing, that funeral directors are not wanting to deal with the dead who have died from that disease,
yeah,
AIDS.
it absolutely has happened in San Francisco. Again, in an article I read, they've mentioned that some gays have actually opened funeral parlors to begin dealing with that. So apparently it was rather widespread.
So it is a real problem,
Yes,
and one that we do need to deal with in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed one of the things that the bishops, again, in their document try to do is to pledge the help of the church. The church, they say, we want to be part of the solution here. Mm-hmm. We want to be careful that we create a climate of compassion. As you've suggested, maybe they've not done that as well as some would like, but they want to move in that direction. They talk about, ask each diocese to develop a general employment policy for all employees with life-threatening illnesses, including AIDS. Mm-hmm. So I think what they're trying to do is set up a model and say, well, within our Catholic diocese, we're going to make sure that people with AIDS don't get fired and that they have adequate health insurance, which is another whole slant to this thing.
They also come out very strongly against the idea of quarantining people with gays, and also very strongly against discriminatory testing of all people. And I think both of those points are very important.
Yeah, good. Do you want to say anything more about that? I agree with you, and that is a great fear among people, the discriminatory testing.
Yeah. Well, there are certain people in Congress, William Dannemeyer comes to mind immediately, but others, who are really pushing that now. I mean, it's almost like a concentration camp kind of thing, and the bishops say that this will not solve the problem, will not alleviate it in any way, and is immoral. And their strong position was really one of the best things, I thought, in the entire document.
They did make that very strongly, that's for sure. Well, Roland, we've been talking about the question of AIDS and concentrating on the care for people who have contracted the disease. You very personally have brought out, I mean, the kinds of suffering and psychological difficulties that these people undergo. And I guess the gospel message is that Jesus was the one who acted with compassion, and the message for the culture as a whole is that every person has dignity and worth and must be treated in that way. Very good. I think we did, however, the gay thing. I think so. I would have trouble thinking about a third program that way.